I'm tired of lying. Your sister is who I really want, my husband said. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break, it settled. The words hung in the air like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. Not the woman who had spent 42 years building a home, raising a son, and believing that loyalty meant something. I remember the way the late afternoon light came through the kitchen window, hitting the edge of the marble countertop we had picked out together 20 years ago, back when Daniel still asked for my opinion. Rachel stood a few feet behind him, her arms folded loosely, her expression calm in a way that felt rehearsed, like she had already lived this scene in her mind and decided how it would end. I didn't look at her right away. I kept my eyes on Daniel, on the man whose shirts I still ironed every Sunday morning, whose coffee I still made exactly the way he liked, 1 teaspoon of sugar, just enough cream to turn it light but not pale. Say that again, I said quietly, not because I hadn't heard him, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it twice to make sure it was real. He sighed, as if I were the one exhausting him. I don't love you anymore, Margaret. I haven't for a while. I've been trying to do the right thing, but I can't keep pretending. Rachel, she understands me. Rachel, my younger sister. The same woman I had let stay in our guest room 6 months ago after her second divorce. The same woman I had defended when people said she moved through life leaving damage behind her. I finally turned to look at her, really look, and she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She just held my gaze with a softness that almost made it worse, like she believed this was something gentle, something inevitable, something that would make sense if I just gave it time. I nodded once slowly, like I was processing a minor inconvenience, like a delayed flight or a broken appliance. Okay, I said. Just that. One word. Daniel blinked, clearly expecting something louder, something messier. That's it, he asked. You're not going to argue? Cry. Say something. I almost smiled then, not out of humor, but because I could see it so clearly how small his understanding of me had become. What would be the point? I replied. You've already decided. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, as if my calm was somehow unfair. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her voice careful. Margaret, I never meant for this to happen like this. I raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to stop her. Don't, I said. Whatever you think this is, don't dress it up for me. Silence settled over the kitchen, thick and unfamiliar. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. A dog barked. Ordinary sounds, completely disconnected from the moment that was quietly rearranging the rest of my life. Daniel cleared his throat. I've already spoken to a lawyer. We can keep this simple. The house, we can figure that out. I just want to move forward without complications. Without complications. As if I were an inconvenience he could file away like old paperwork. I nodded again, the same slow, measured motion. Of course, I said. Simple sounds good. He studied my face, searching for something. Anger, pain, anything he could recognize. But I gave him nothing. Because the truth was, this wasn't the moment everything fell apart. This was just the moment he finally said it out loud. I had known for 3 weeks. 3 quiet, observant, sleepless weeks. I had seen the messages he thought he deleted. Noticed the way Rachel's laughter lingered too long when he was in the room. The way Daniel had started locking his phone. Something he had never done in 4 decades of marriage. I had watched, listened, and said nothing. Not because I was afraid, and not because I was in denial, but because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to be sure. So as Daniel stood there, waiting for a reaction, and Rachel hovered beside him, believing they were finally stepping into some kind of truth, I simply folded my hands on the counter and said, "Let me know what the lawyer says. I'll cooperate." He exhaled, relieved, as if I had just made his life easier. Rachel's shoulders relaxed, her expression softening into something almost grateful. They thought this was the end of something. They thought I was stepping aside. And I let them believe it, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not react at all. Sometimes you let people show you exactly who they are. And then you decide what to do with that truth. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, in the home I had built piece by piece, I realized something with absolute clarity. I wasn't the one losing anything. I was simply seeing everything for what it had already become. I did not sleep that night, not because I was shocked, but because everything finally made sense in a way that would not let my mind rest. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it had already accepted a version of the future I had not yet agreed to. I lay on my side of the bed, the same side I had slept on for decades, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, counting each rotation like it could anchor me to something steady. Daniel had moved to the guest room without saying much. Just a brief, almost polite statement that it would be easier that way. And I let him go without a word, because there was nothing left to negotiate in that moment. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was clear, clean, like a line drawn across the floor that neither of us would cross again. Sometime around 2 in the morning I got up and walked through the house, not turning on any lights. I did not need them. I knew every inch of that place, every creak in the floorboards, every corner where memories had settled over the years. I paused in the kitchen where everything had unfolded earlier. The same marble countertop, the same chairs, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator, and I placed my hand flat against the surface, grounding myself in something real, something that belonged to me long before either of them decided to rewrite my life. 3 weeks. That was how long I had known, not in a dramatic, undeniable way at first, but in small, almost invisible shifts that only someone paying close attention would notice. It started with a message, not even a full sentence, just a preview that appeared on Daniel's phone when he left it on the table one evening. A name that should not have been there, paired with a tone that felt too familiar, too warm. I did not confront him then, I simply filed it away. The next day I watched how he reacted when Rachel walked into the room, the way his posture changed, the slight pause before he spoke, the kind of hesitation that comes when someone is aware of being observed. Rachel, for her part, was just as careful. She never did anything obvious, never crossed a line that could be pointed to and labeled, but there was a rhythm between them, a quiet understanding that did not belong to siblings-in-law. I began to notice how often they found reasons to be alone together, small errands that suddenly required both of them, conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. I said nothing, not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I wanted to see how far it would go when they believed no one was watching. I started paying attention to details I had once ignored, the timing of his phone calls, the way he angled the screen away from me, the new habit of taking his phone with him even when he walked 10 feet to the garage, something he had never done in all our years together. One afternoon while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed again on the bathroom counter, and for a moment I stood there, not moving, just listening to the sound, deciding what kind of person I was going to be next. I did not rush, I did not panic. I simply picked it up and looked, not scrolling, not searching, just reading what was already there. And it was enough, more than enough. The tone, the familiarity, the ease between them. It was not new, it was not accidental, it was practiced, developed over time while I was still setting the table, still folding his shirts, still believing that routine meant stability. I placed the phone back exactly where it had been and walked out of the room without a sound. From that moment on, everything shifted, not outwardly, not in a way they could detect, but inside me something became very still, very focused. I stopped asking questions I did not need answers to. I stopped filling silences with conversation. I watched, I listened, and I waited, because there is a difference between suspecting something and knowing it, and I wanted to know completely before I decided what to do. Over the next few days I confirmed what I already understood, not through confrontation but through observation, patterns that repeated, details that aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. And once I had that clarity, I did something that surprised even me. I did nothing. I continued as if everything was normal. I cooked dinner, I asked about his day, I listened to Rachel talk about her plans as if she were still just my sister needing a place to land. And all the while I let them believe they were getting away with something, that their secret was intact, because sometimes the most revealing thing is not what people hide, but how they behave when they think they are safe. And by the time Daniel finally stood in front of me and said the words he thought would change everything, I had already moved past the shock. I had already stepped into a different role entirely, one where I was no longer reacting but deciding. And as the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I did not drink, looking around at the life I had built. And I understood with a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be shaped by their choices but by mine. I did not confront them the next day or the day after that, because confrontation would have given them control over the pace of what was happening, and I was no longer interested in reacting to anything they did. I was interested in understanding everything they had already done, and more importantly, what they planned to do next. The house shifted subtly over those days, not in structure but in atmosphere, as if it had begun to belong to someone else already. Daniel moved through it with a quiet efficiency, making calls in low tones, stepping outside more often than usual, his movements purposeful in a way that told me decisions had been made long before he spoke them out loud to me. Rachel, on the other hand, settled in more comfortably than I had ever seen her before. She rearranged small things in the kitchen, moved a vase from one shelf to another, changed the placement of dish towels, details so minor they could be dismissed, but I noticed all of them because they spoke of something deeper, a sense of ownership she had not earned but had already claimed in her mind. I watched her one morning as she stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug, sunlight catching in her hair, and for a brief moment I saw her not as my sister, but as a stranger who had stepped into a life that was never hers to take, and I realized then that whatever this was between her and Daniel, it was not impulsive, it was not something that had simply happened, it had been allowed to grow carefully, quietly over time, and that meant there were plans attached to it, plans that likely extended far beyond the conversation we had in the kitchen. That afternoon I heard Daniel on the phone in his study, the door slightly ajar, his voice low but clear enough for certain words to reach me, phrases like paperwork, timeline, transfer, and that was when the final piece settled into place. This was not just about leaving, it was about positioning, about securing something before walking away. I did not pause outside the door or lean in to listen more closely. I did not need to, I had heard enough to understand the direction of things, and I walked away just as quietly as I had approached, returning to the living room where I sat down in my usual chair, folded my hands in my lap, and let the realization settle without letting it show on my face. That evening at dinner, the three of us sat at the table like we had done countless times before, plates neatly arranged, utensils placed with familiar precision, and yet nothing about it felt the same. Daniel spoke about routine things, a meeting he had earlier that day, a client who was difficult to deal with, his tone steady, almost rehearsed. Rachel chimed in occasionally, her voice light, her words carefully chosen to sound normal, but there was a layer beneath it all, something unspoken but heavy, like a script they both knew and were trying to follow without breaking character. I nodded where appropriate, responded when necessary, and kept my voice even, because there was no benefit in letting them see the shift that had already taken place inside me. After dinner, Rachel offered to help clean up, something she had not done often before, and I let her, standing beside her at the sink as we washed dishes in silence, the sound of running water filling the space between us. She glanced at me once briefly as if trying to read something in my expression, but I kept my focus on the plate in my hands, steady, unhurried, giving her nothing she could interpret. Later that night, after they had both gone to their separate rooms, I sat alone in the living room, the television on but muted, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows across the walls, and I began to think not about what had happened, but about what was coming, because whatever Daniel was arranging, whatever Rachel believed she was stepping into, it was built on an assumption that I would either fight emotionally or retreat quietly, that I would respond in ways that made me predictable, manageable, but they had miscalculated something fundamental. They had assumed I would remain the version of myself they had grown used to, the one who prioritized peace over clarity, who smoothed over discomfort instead of examining it, and that version of me no longer existed. The next morning I made a call, not in secrecy, not in panic, but with the same calm deliberation I had carried through everything else. I did not explain much, I did not need to, I simply set a meeting, asked a few precise questions, and listened carefully to the answers, because if there were documents being prepared, timelines being discussed, then I needed to understand exactly where I stood before any of it was finalized, not emotionally, but practically. And as I ended the call and set the phone down on the table, I felt something settle into place with quiet certainty. They believed they were moving forward, that they were shaping the outcome of this situation, but what they did not realize was that I had already stepped ahead of them, not loudly, not visibly, but decisively. And sometimes the most dangerous position to be in is not when someone is angry, but when they are calm enough to see everything clearly and choose their next move without hesitation. The meeting I scheduled was set for 10:30 in the morning. A quiet office on the third floor of a brick building downtown that I had passed hundreds of times over the years without ever needing to go inside. And yet as I walked through the glass doors that day, I felt no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a steady awareness that this was a step I should have taken sooner. The receptionist greeted me politely, asked my name, and directed me to a waiting area where everything was arranged with careful neutrality, beige chairs, a small wooden table with neatly stacked magazines, a faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, just as I had done at home, and waited without checking my phone, without shifting in my seat, because patience had become something I understood differently now. After a few minutes, a man in his early 50s stepped out and called my name, his voice calm, professional. He introduced himself as Michael Turner, and for a brief second I noticed the coincidence of the last name, though it held no meaning here. I followed him into his office, where sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting long, quiet lines across the desk. He gestured for me to sit, and once I did, he waited, not rushing me, not filling the silence, and I appreciated that, because it allowed me to begin exactly the way I intended. I need to understand my position, I said, my voice even, steady, not emotional, not defensive, just clear. He nodded once, as if he had heard that sentence many times before, and asked a few measured questions: how long I had been married, what assets were shared, whether there had ever been any formal agreements in place. I answered each one carefully, not rushing, not adding unnecessary detail, just giving him what he needed to see. The structure of my situation. When I mentioned the house, his expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. And the property is in both of your names? He asked. I paused, just for a second, long enough to recall the exact wording on the documents Daniel and I had signed years ago. No, I said. It was purchased under my name before we were married, and we never changed the title. He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering that, and then made a note, the sound of his pen against paper quiet but deliberate. That is important, he said, not with surprise but with the kind of emphasis that told me it mattered more than Daniel likely realized. We went through everything else in the same manner: accounts, investments, retirement funds, each detail laid out clearly, without emotion attached to it, just facts, structure, reality. And with each answer, I could feel the shape of the situation becoming more defined, less abstract, less controlled by whatever narrative Daniel had constructed in his mind. At one point, Michael looked up at me and asked, "Do you believe your husband has already begun preparing for this legally?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I said. "I am certain of it." He nodded again, not surprised, as if this was a familiar pattern, and then he asked the question that mattered most, "And what would you like to do moving forward?" For a moment I did not answer, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to choose the exact words that would define everything that came next. I could have said that I wanted to fight, to protect what was mine, to challenge whatever he and Rachel thought they were building, but none of those words felt precise enough. Instead I said, "I want to make sure that whatever happens next is based on the truth, not assumptions." He watched me for a second, then nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said out loud. "That is a good place to start," he replied. We discussed timelines, possible scenarios, what Daniel might attempt, and what I could do to ensure that I was not caught off guard. And through it all I remained calm, not detached but focused, because this was no longer about emotion, it was about clarity, about understanding the structure beneath the situation. When the meeting ended, I stood, thanked him, and walked out of the office with the same steady pace I had carried in. The city outside looked the same as it always had, people moving along the sidewalks, cars passing in steady lines. Nothing in the world had shifted in any visible way, and yet everything had changed in a way that only I could feel. When I got back home, the house was quiet. Daniel was not there. Rachel was in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine as if she had nothing else to consider. She looked up when I walked in, her expression curious but controlled. "You were out early," she said lightly. I set my keys down on the table, removed my coat, and met her gaze with the same calm I had maintained everywhere else. "I had something to take care of," I replied, and for a brief moment something flickered in her eyes, not fear exactly but uncertainty, as if she realized, perhaps for the first time, that there were parts of this situation she did not fully understand. And I let that moment pass without explanation, because there would be time for everything to unfold. And as I moved through the house, setting things back into their places, I felt a quiet certainty settle. Deeper within me, they believed they were planning the future, but what they did not see was that the foundation they were standing on was not as secure as they thought, and I had no intention of warning them before it shifted beneath their feet. Daniel came home later than usual that evening, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway carrying a different weight now. Not anticipation, not routine, but something measured, something deliberate. I was in the kitchen when he walked in, standing by the stove even though nothing was cooking, my hands resting lightly on the counter as if I had been there for hours. He paused when he saw me, just for a second, as if he was recalibrating, trying to understand what version of me he was walking into. "You are still here," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either, just stating a fact he had not fully expected. I turned my head slightly and looked at him, calm, steady. "Of course I am," I replied. "It is still my home." The words were simple, but I saw the way they landed, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. He loosened his tie and walked further inside, placing his keys on the table in a way that felt slightly more forceful than necessary. "We should talk about next steps," he said, his tone shifting into something more formal, almost rehearsed. I nodded once. Yes, we should, I said, not moving, not inviting him to sit, not creating the familiar rhythm we had always followed, because that rhythm no longer belonged to us. He glanced around the kitchen, as if looking for something to anchor the conversation, then leaned against the edge of the counter across from me, keeping just enough distance to feel intentional. I have already spoken with a lawyer, he began. We can file quickly, keep things straightforward, avoid anything unnecessary. Unnecessary, the word lingered in the air, as if everything we had built together could now be categorized and minimized into something efficient. I listened without interrupting, letting him outline what he believed the future would look like, timelines, documents, arrangements, all presented with a calm confidence that suggested he had already mapped everything out. And as he spoke, I realized something important. He was not asking, he was informing. He had already decided how this would go. He simply expected me to follow along. When he finished, there was a brief silence, and he watched me carefully, waiting for a reaction that would confirm his assumptions. I met his gaze evenly. That sounds organized, I said, and for a moment I saw confusion flicker across his face, not because of what I said, but because of what I did not say. I did not question him, I did not push back, I did not ask for clarification. I simply acknowledged his plan as if it were one version of many, and that unsettled him more than any argument could have. Rachel appeared in the doorway then, her presence quiet but intentional, as if she had been listening just out of sight. She stepped into the room slowly, her expression composed, but her eyes searching, always searching. Is everything all right? She asked, her voice light, almost careful. Daniel nodded quickly. We are just discussing logistics, he said, and the word felt oddly clinical, like this was a transaction rather than the dismantling of a life. I glanced at her briefly, just long enough to acknowledge her presence, then returned my attention to Daniel. I will need to review everything before I agree to anything, I said, my tone unchanged, steady, controlled, and this time, the shift in the room was unmistakable. Daniel straightened slightly, his posture tightening. There is nothing complicated about it, he replied, a hint of impatience slipping through. We can handle this without making it difficult. I held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. Difficult for whom? I asked quietly, and the question lingered longer than either of them expected. Rachel shifted her weight slightly, her hand brushing against the edge of the table, a small movement, but one that revealed more than her words ever would. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if recalculating again. I am trying to make this easier for everyone, he said, and I almost admired how easily he framed it that way, as if efficiency were kindness, as if simplicity were fairness. I nodded once more. Then we should make sure everything is clear, I replied, and with that, I turned back to the counter, signaling the end of the conversation without raising my voice, without needing permission, because control does not always come from what you say. Sometimes it comes from when you choose to stop speaking. The silence that followed was different. This time, heavier, less certain, and I could feel it settle around them in a way they were not prepared for. Later that night, as I moved through the house, turning off lights, closing doors, restoring the quiet order that had always comforted me, I became aware of something subtle but undeniable. The balance had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way they could fully see yet, but beneath the surface, in the structure of what was happening. They had expected resistance or surrender, something familiar, something predictable, but what they were facing instead was something they did not recognize, something they could not easily manage. And as I stood at the window, looking out at the darkened street, the soft glow of the streetlight stretching across the pavement, I understood with complete clarity that whatever plan they believed they were executing, it no longer belonged entirely to them, because the moment I stopped reacting was the moment I started deciding, and decisions made in silence are often the ones that change everything. The next few days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that would have felt unnatural to me before, but now it felt necessary, even grounding. I moved through each morning with the same routine I had followed for years, waking at 6, making coffee, opening the curtains to let in the early light. But beneath those familiar actions there was a new awareness, a steady calculation that shaped every decision I made. Daniel became more direct during that time, less cautious, as if my calm had reassured him that things would proceed exactly as he expected. He spoke more openly about timelines, about how quickly everything could be finalized, about how it would be better for everyone if we handled things efficiently, and I listened, always listening, never interrupting, never challenging him in ways that would reveal how much I already Understood. Rachel, meanwhile, settled further into the house, her presence no longer tentative. She moved with a quiet confidence that suggested she believed this transition was already complete. She began using the kitchen as if it were hers, rearranging cabinets, bringing in small items that did not belong to me, a new set of mugs, a different brand of coffee, subtle changes that might have gone unnoticed once, but now stood out clearly, not because of what they were, but because of what they represented, a slow, deliberate assumption of space that had not yet been granted. I did not stop her. I did not comment, because resistance would have only confirmed her position. Instead I observed, I noted, and I let her believe that her place in this house was already secured. One afternoon, Daniel placed a folder on the dining table, its contents neatly organized, the kind of careful preparation that spoke of planning rather than impulse. "These are the initial documents," he said. His tone measured, controlled, as if he were presenting something reasonable, something inevitable. I walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down, opening the folder without hesitation. Page after page outlined his version of how things should proceed, property, accounts, timelines, all structured in a way that assumed agreement rather than negotiation. I read each line slowly, not because I needed time to understand it, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of my attention, the deliberate pace of someone who was not overwhelmed, not confused, but fully aware. When I finished, I closed the folder and placed it neatly back on the table. "I will have this reviewed," I said, and that was when I saw it, the first real crack in his certainty. It was subtle, a slight tightening around his eyes, a brief pause before he responded. "There is no need to complicate this," he said, and I almost recognized the tone. It was the same one he used years ago when he wanted to dismiss something, to move past it quickly. But this time it did not carry the same authority. "Clarity is not complication," I replied, my voice steady, not raised, not sharp, just firm enough to establish something new. Rachel was standing near the doorway, listening again, her expression composed but her posture more rigid than before. She was beginning to understand that this was not unfolding in the simple, predictable way she had imagined. Later that evening, after they had both retreated to their separate corners of the house, I sat alone with the documents in front of me, the quiet hum of the house surrounding me, and I reviewed them again, not emotionally, not with any sense of betrayal, but with focus, with precision, because every line revealed something about what Daniel believed he could claim, what he assumed I would accept, and what he had overlooked entirely. The next morning I returned to the office downtown, the same steady walk, the same composed presence, and placed the folder on the desk in front of Michael. He read through it carefully, his expression neutral but attentive, and when he finished, he looked up at me with a clarity that matched my own. "He is moving quickly," he said, and I nodded. "Yes, he believes that is to his advantage." Michael leaned back slightly, considering, then gave a small, knowing nod. "It might be," he said. "If everything were as simple as he thinks." There was a brief silence, and then he began outlining the details, the points Daniel had structured in his favor, the areas where assumptions had been made without full understanding, and most importantly, the elements that had been entirely ignored. And as he spoke, I felt that quiet certainty deepen, not as a reaction but as a confirmation, because everything I had sensed, everything I had chosen not to confront directly, was now laid out clearly, supported by fact rather than intuition. When I left the office that day, I did not feel victorious, I did not feel angry, I felt prepared, and preparation has a different kind of power, one that does not need to announce itself. When I returned home, the house looked the same. Rachel was in the kitchen again, Daniel was in his study, the structure of their new reality still intact, but beneath it, something had shifted in a way they could not yet see. I set my bag down, walked through the house with the same calm presence I had maintained all along, and allowed myself a single quiet realization: they believed they were ahead of me, that they were guiding the outcome, but what they did not understand was that I had already stepped into a position where their expectations no longer defined what would happen next, and from that place, every move they made would only bring them closer to a result they had never considered. By the end of that week, something changed in the way Daniel looked at me, not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to in a single moment, but in a gradual shift that revealed uncertainty where there had once been confidence. He had expected resistance or emotion, something he could anticipate and respond to, but what he was facing instead was something quieter, something that did not follow any pattern he understood, and that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. I continued exactly as I had been, waking early, maintaining the house, speaking only when necessary, my tone even, my movements deliberate, Never rushed, never reactive, and in that consistency, I created a kind of stillness that forced both of them to become aware of what they could not control. One evening, Daniel approached me again, this time in the living room, where I was seated with a book open in my lap. Though I had not turned a page in several minutes, he stood a few feet away, his posture more rigid than before, as if he had rehearsed what he was about to say. "I need to know if you are going to cooperate," he said, and the word cooperate carried a weight that suggested expectation rather than request. I looked up at him slowly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "I have not done anything to suggest otherwise," I replied, my voice calm, measured, and that was the truth. I had not argued, I had not resisted, I had simply refused to move at his pace. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that felt more strained than casual. "The sooner we finalize everything, the better it will be for everyone," he added, and I could hear the edge beneath his words now, the faint urgency that had not been there before. I closed the book gently and placed it on the table beside me, not as a signal of surrender, but as a decision to give him my full attention. "Then we should make sure everything is done correctly," I said, and again I saw it, that flicker of doubt, that moment where his certainty did not quite hold. Rachel entered the room shortly after, her presence no longer as confident as it had been days before. She stood near the doorway, watching, listening, her expression composed but her eyes sharper now, more alert, as if she were trying to understand a situation that was no longer unfolding according to her expectations. "Daniel has been trying to make this as smooth as possible," she said, her tone gentle, almost persuasive, and I turned my head slightly toward her, acknowledging her words without accepting their premise. "Smooth for whom?" I asked again, and this time the question settled differently, heavier, more pointed, because it had already been asked once, and they both knew it. Daniel shifted his weight, clearly frustrated now, though he tried to mask it with composure. "There is no need to make this more complicated than it is," he said, and I nodded slowly, as if considering his perspective. "I agree," I replied, "which is why I will not rush into anything without understanding it fully." The room fell silent after that. Not tense, not explosive, but undeniably different, because in that moment something became clear to both of them. They were no longer leading this process, they were reacting to it. Later that night, I sat alone at the dining table with the documents spread out in front of me, not because I needed to review them again, but because I wanted to visualize the structure of everything, the assumptions Daniel had made, the positions he believed were secure, and the gaps he had not considered, and as I traced each line with my eyes, I began to see not just what he had planned, but how he expected me to behave within that plan, compliant, emotional, eager to resolve things quickly. And that realization was more valuable than any single detail in the paperwork, because it revealed the foundation of his entire approach. It was built on an understanding of me that was no longer accurate. The next morning, I did something very simple, something that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. I agreed to his timeline, not entirely, not without conditions, but enough to give him what he needed to feel secure. "I will review everything this week," I said over breakfast, my tone neutral, my expression unchanged. "And we can move forward soon after." Daniel nodded, relief passing quickly across his face before he could fully hide it. Rachel glanced at him, then back at me, her posture easing just slightly, and in that moment I understood exactly what I had done. I had given them confidence, just enough to lower their guard, just enough to allow them to continue exactly as they intended. And that was what I needed, because plans are most vulnerable not when they are questioned, but when they are trusted. And as I stood up from the table, gathering my plate and placing it in the sink, I felt that same quiet certainty settle within me once again. They believed we were moving toward an ending, something clean, something predictable, but what they did not realize was that we were actually moving toward something else entirely, something they had not prepared for, because while they had been focused on what they wanted to take, I had been focused on what they had overlooked, and in that difference everything would eventually change. The day Daniel chose to schedule the final meeting arrived with an almost unsettling sense of normalcy, the kind that makes everything feel quieter than it should, as if the world has stepped back just enough to let something decisive happen without interruption. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the kind of morning where everything looks clean and uncomplicated, and I noticed that detail as I stood by the window before leaving, because it contrasted so sharply with what was about to unfold. Daniel was already dressed when I came downstairs, his movements precise, his expression composed in a way that suggested he believed this was simply the final step in a process he had already completed in his mind. Rachel stood near the kitchen, her presence more contained than usual, Her confidence now tempered by something less certain, something she could not quite name. We did not speak much on the drive. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was defined, each of us occupying a space that did not overlap. When we arrived at the office, everything was prepared, documents arranged neatly on the table, chairs positioned evenly, the environment structured to suggest order, resolution, simplicity. Daniel greeted his attorney with a firm handshake, his tone steady, almost relieved, as if he was stepping into a conclusion he had been waiting for. I took my seat without hesitation, placing my hands lightly on the table, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, not guarded, not defensive, just present. The conversation began with formalities, names, confirmations, a brief outline of what would be reviewed, and as the attorney spoke, I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the assumptions beneath them, the way each point was framed as if it were already agreed upon, as if my role in this process was simply to acknowledge what had been decided. When the documents were finally placed in front of me, I did not reach for them immediately. I let the moment settle, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to shift the rhythm of the room. Daniel glanced at me briefly, a flicker of impatience crossing his face before he masked it again. "Everything is straightforward," he said, his voice calm but edged with expectation. I nodded once, then opened the folder slowly, turning each page with deliberate care, not because I needed time, but because I wanted them to feel it. The weight of my attention, the absence of urgency. I read through the terms, each one aligning with what I had already seen, already understood, the structure he had built, the outcome he believed was inevitable, and when I reached the final page, I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table. "I have a few things to clarify," I said, my voice even, steady, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's posture tightened, Rachel's eyes sharpened. The attorney paused, pen hovering slightly above the paper. "What kind of clarification?" Daniel asked, and there was something in his tone now, not quite concern, but no longer complete certainty. I turned slightly toward my attorney, who had remained quiet until that moment, observing, waiting, and with a simple nod, he began to speak, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that cut through the assumptions that had filled the room. He outlined the ownership of the house, the original title, the legal standing that had never been altered, the implications of that detail on everything Daniel had proposed, and as he spoke, I watched the realization settle, not all at once, but in stages, Daniel's expression shifting from confidence to confusion, then to something tighter, more controlled, Rachel's composure faltering just slightly, her hand moving to rest against the edge of the table as if she needed something to steady herself. The attorney across from us adjusted his posture, flipping through the documents again, searching for something he had overlooked, and in that moment, the structure Daniel had relied on began to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that could be undone with a single argument, but in a way that changed the foundation of everything. I did not speak immediately, I did not need to, because the silence that followed carried more weight than any words I could have added. When I finally looked at Daniel, my expression unchanged, my voice calm, I said, "I told you I would not agree to anything without understanding it fully." And that was when it became clear, not just to him, but to everyone in the room, that this was no longer the conclusion he had planned. It was something else entirely, something he had not anticipated, because while he had been focused on moving quickly, on finalizing things before they became complicated, I had been focused on something else, something quieter, something more deliberate. And as the conversation continued, shifting now, adjusting to the reality that had just been introduced, I remained exactly where I had been all along, steady, composed, not reacting but directing, and in that difference everything began to change in ways they could no longer ignore. The silence in the room did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like something heavy being moved just enough to reveal what had been hidden underneath. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression controlled but no longer steady, his eyes moving between the documents and the attorney as if searching for a version of events that would return things to how he expected them to be. Rachel sat very still beside him, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a kind of quiet awareness that this situation was no longer unfolding in her favor. The attorney cleared his throat and began to adjust the language, the terms, the assumptions that had been presented so confidently just minutes before, and I listened, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with clarity, because this was not about winning, it was about truth finally being acknowledged in a space where it could no longer be ignored. Daniel finally spoke, his voice lower now, more measured. "This was not what we discussed," he said, not directly to me but to his Attorney, and I could hear the strain beneath the words, the realization that something essential had been overlooked. The attorney responded carefully, explaining the implications, the legal standing of the property, the limitations of what could be claimed, and as he spoke, the structure Daniel had relied on continued to shift, not collapsing, but reshaping into something far less certain. I folded my hands on the table, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because there was no need to react to something I had already understood. When Daniel finally looked at me, really looked, there was something different in his gaze, not anger, not even resentment, but a kind of reluctant recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. You knew, he said quietly, and I met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, I replied, just that, no explanation, no elaboration, because the truth does not require decoration. Rachel shifted beside him, her voice softer now. Uncertain. Margaret, we were not trying to. She stopped before finishing the sentence, as if the words no longer felt convincing even to her. I turned my head slightly toward her, not unkindly but without any softness either. You were trying to build something, I said, my tone even. You just assumed it would not cost you anything. The room fell silent again after that, but this time the silence was different. It was not filled with expectation or tension. It was filled with understanding. The kind that settles when there is nothing left to misunderstand. The rest of the meeting continued in a more measured way. Adjustments were discussed, terms were reconsidered, timelines were no longer dictated but negotiated. And through it all, I remained steady, not pushing, not retreating, simply present, because that was all that was needed. When it was over, when the documents were gathered and the chairs pushed back, I stood up without hesitation, smoothing my coat as I did. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, as if he needed time to process the shift that had just taken place. Rachel avoided my gaze entirely, her focus fixed somewhere on the table, as if looking up would force her to acknowledge something she was not ready to face. I did not wait for either of them. I walked toward the door with the same calm pace I had carried through everything, and as I stepped outside, the air felt different, not because anything had changed in the world around me, but because something had settled within me in a way that would not shift again. I did not look back, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. When I reached my car, I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the door, and allowed myself a single quiet reflection. They had believed this would be simple, that it would unfold according to their expectations, that I would either resist or retreat, but they had misunderstood something fundamental. They had mistaken silence for weakness, patience for passivity, and in doing so, they had given me exactly what I needed: time, clarity, and space to see everything as it truly was. I opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it with a soft, final sound, and as I started the engine and pulled away, I understood something with complete certainty. They had not taken anything from me. They had only revealed what no longer belonged in my life, and that kind of clarity is not a loss, it is a beginning.